Hey everyone, this is Mike and welcome back to Raiding 101. Today we're going to be talking about raid buffs, and when I say raid buffs I mean stuff that makes your party deal more damage. I'm not going to be talking about mitigation today. Defensive raid buffs will come tomorrow, where I'm going to be talking about all of the different damage types that are in the game and how each type of mitigation will interact with those outgoing damage types. So today it's going to be all about dealing more damage. Now, when it comes down to raid buffs, on one hand it's a very simple concept. You press a button and you deal more damage, or your party deals more damage, but in reality it's a lot more complex than that. So I'm going to try and keep this video as simple as possible. I've recorded it like 4 or 5 times at this point, and I keep talking about way too much complex stuff when it comes down to all of these things. So I'm gonna try to keep it as simple as possible. So if it is a much more complicated episode, I guess we'll call it, than the other stuff that I've talked about so far, I apologize in advance, but I'm trying to do my best to keep it as simple as possible. Now, when it comes down to raid buffs, these are basically actions that will buff the raid so that you will deal more damage. Of course, depending on what raid buff you have, they will affect different people in the party. For example, say Monk and Red Mage benefit only the physical damage dealers, whereas something like Ninja, Astrologian, Scholar, those affect pretty much everyone. And then again, for example, something like a Warrior does not make full usage of a Scholar or a Dragoon's raid buff either. So depending on what job you play, certain raid buffs might be more important for you for dealing damage because of how they interact with your own kit. When it comes down to raid buffs, it's also important that you use them on cooldown to keep them aligned not only with the other people's raid buffs, but also to keep them aligned with your own personal burst phase. Pretty much every job in this game, most at least, have a burst phase that is tied to their rotation. For example, if you look at Ninja, Ninja has a 1-minute burst underneath their own trick attack. Their trick attack is their raid buff, but on the other hand, their own personal burst also aligns with that. If I look at, for example, a Red Mage, their melee attack is their burst phase, although that does not necessarily align that well with other raid buffs because of the random nature of it. For example, if I look at Summoner, Summoner has like every minute where they have that new summon. So for example, at 1 minute you have your Bahamut, at 2 minutes, well no, basically in the opener you have Bahamut, then at 1 minute you have your Phoenix, at 2 minutes you have Bahamut again, 3 minutes the Phoenix again, that kind of stuff. So you basically always have some kind of a burst or personal burst underneath some sort of raid buff. So it's pretty important to kind of keep your own burst aligned with these raid buffs, and on the other hand it's also important for your team to keep the raid buffs aligned together with your burst then again as well, because it kind of goes both ways. On one hand, you need to make sure that your rotation is on point and that every time that you are going to be hitting that 60-second, 120-second mark, that you're going to be having your burst phase ready for when those raid buffs come out. On the other hand, your team also needs to make sure that they use their stuff on cooldown so that they all stay aligned as well. Because of course, it's very important to keep stuff aligned, because when your burst phase happens underneath a raid buff, it is going to exponentially increase in damage, because of course if you only do it under 1 raid buff, it's going to be a little bit of extra damage, but if you do it under 4 raid buffs, for example, you're going to be doing a whole lot more damage. That's why it's important to keep all of that stuff aligned. Now, the main reason why it's very important to align these raid buffs and keep them aligned is for when you do the reopener. The reopener is basically your 6 minutes, because that is where you're gonna have everything available again. I'm gonna put a picture on screen real quick where I show where all of your raid buffs kind of fall, and you can see that at the opener we have everything, then at 2, 3, and 4 minutes we have a lot, and then at 6 minutes we have everything again. Now, if you know, like for example yesterday I talked about something like a potion, and a potion is something that makes your damage go out like a crap load higher, because a potion makes you do a lot more damage. Now, a potion has a 4.5 minute cooldown on it, meaning that you don't really want to be using it during that Brotherhood window or during the 5-minute trick, but you want to use it again at the 6 minutes, because as you can see, during the opener is where you have everything, all of the raid buffs and your potion, and then at 6 minutes you have all of the raid buffs again and your potion as well. So it's important that during these 2 burst windows you have not only all of your raid buffs aligned, but you also have that potion. Now, depending on each fight, the raid buffs might fall a little bit different, because of course if we're looking at the graph like the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and then 6 minutes, this is of course not taking into account that a boss might phase away. There might be downtime, like for example if you look at E6 Savage, when Garuda and Ifrit fuse together to combine into Raktapaska, you can't hit the boss for like 20 seconds or something like that. So if raid buffs come up during that window, you can't use them of course, so that's why you might have to delay things here or there. And that brings me into part 2 of this video. So part 1 is use your raid buffs on cooldown as much as possible to align it not only with other people's raid buffs, but also with other people's burst windows. But now in part 2, we're going to talk about how you should sometimes delay your raid buffs and then also realign yourself again, depending on downtime on bosses, but also depending on kill time and that kind of stuff. Because for the most part, if, for example, say you need to use a buff and you only get 10 seconds out of it instead of 20, but you get a second usage of it, then that is still worth it. Whereas otherwise, if, for example, say you can only use it for 10 seconds, but as, for example, if you delay it and you get the full usage out of it and you don't lose a usage, then delaying it is usually the better option. And that's where we're going to be talking about a little bit more fight-specific stuff, as well as some optimization theory when it comes down to the DPS checks that matter. Because, of course, for example, if we look at E7 and E8, both of these fights have an add phase, and the add phase DPS is not necessarily super hard, and in the grand scheme of things, it also doesn't matter. Like, doing damage on the E7 adds is not as important as doing damage on the boss itself, because the boss is the DPS check that you have to beat. The adds DPS check, of course, technically you have to beat as well, but it's not as hard to beat as, for example, the boss's one. If I look at E8, it's even more like that, because you're like split into 2 groups right there. So if you use raid buffs on E8, it's only gonna benefit 4 people and that kind of stuff. So that's why we're gonna be talking about that stuff as well and how we handle it in my group specifically. So if we look at E5 Savage, when we have our 4-minute raid buff, so again, if we look at the charts real quick, that's where we have, for example, in my group specifically, a trick attack, a chain stratagem, a divination, and we also have some own personal burst windows, like, for example, our machinist has their wildfire there. Wildfire, of course, not a raid buff, but it is a personal burst window. So what we decided to do during this Furies 14 is, instead of using our raid buffs right before Ramuh disappears, we decide to hold our raid buffs, everything, so not only the raid buffs, but for example our machinist also holds his wildfire until the boss comes back. Reason for that is, if we use them before he does Furies 14, we're gonna be losing a few seconds on those raid buffs, and we want to use the most out of our raid buffs as possible. So that's why we hold them until afterwards. The other reason for that is, by holding them there for a few seconds, we're also not using a usage. If we're going to be losing a usage, it would be worth using our raid buffs before he disappears, but if we're not losing a usage, then it is worth holding on to them for later when Ramuh comes back, because of course Ramuh is one big DPS check, so it wouldn't really make sense to want to lose a usage or something like that depending on your kill time. If we look at E6 Savage, we kind of have a similar scenario, but a little bit different. So when, I believe it is when Garuda and Ifrit are combining together into the final boss, that is where our ninja has his trick attack, and during that animation, of course, he can't use his trick attack, meaning that when the bosses come back, his trick attack will technically be 20 seconds delayed. Now, because it is the 5-minute trick, that means that all of a sudden, if we were to use our 6 minutes on cooldown together with our potions, it would be missing a trick attack, and we don't want to do that, of course. So what we do instead is we will hold all of our 3 minutes, we will hold our potion usage until our ninja has his trick attack available again, and then we use all of our 6 minutes together with that potion, 20 seconds delayed of where we would normally be. So instead of at 6 minutes having all of our buffs available, we have them at 6 minutes and 20 seconds, because that's when our ninja will have its trick attack again. The reason why we do this is because that way he will get an extra trick attack at like 7 minutes, or like 7 minutes 20, but on the other hand, we're not going to reach 9 minutes into the fight to get another set of 3-minute buffs. So because we know that we're not going to get an extra usage out of our 3-minute buffs, we can use it there because, well, we're not losing anything by doing so, basically. So if it is possible to have something like that with downtime happen, and you can get an extra usage out of a low cooldown raid buff, then it's better to delay the long cooldown raid buffs to align themselves again with your burst window of the lower cooldown and that kind of stuff. Now, when it comes down to add phases and that kind of stuff, those DPS checks usually don't matter as much. Now, of course, as you're progging through the fight, you might want to use some raid buffs during those ad phases to make sure that you have enough DPS to clear that check, because of course the ad phases have their own DPS check as well. But if you look at the grand scheme of things, usually you want to be using your raid buffs on the boss itself as much as possible, and not necessarily on an ad phase. So what we do on E7 Savage, for example, is we don't use our 3 minutes there, but we instead hold them. I think we save our 2-minute buffs as well. We hold them for when the boss comes back and the ad phase is gone. So for example, me as a black mage, I use my ley lines at the start because that's only 90 seconds, I get that back. But then, for example, towards the end of the ad phase, my ley lines is back. So instead of me using ley lines again, just to kill the ads faster, I just save my ley lines for when the boss comes back. And that is of course a personal damage buff, but it works like that for other people as well. So you basically want to be saving your buffs for when the boss comes back, because the way it works out with your timers as well, you can basically do a almost complete reopener with all of the raid buffs and that kind of stuff, together with potions as well, because that is one of the fights where you can get 3 potions in, I believe. Shiva is another one where you can get 3 pots in. So if you're getting close to enraged and that kind of stuff, it's basically more worth it to hold your buffs during the ad phase and then use them again when the boss comes back. Shiva is another good example of this, where especially Shiva, because in Shiva you're divided into groups. So if you use a raid buff there, you're only going to be benefiting 4 people instead of 8. And the ad phase also doesn't have as tight of a DPS check because they're all different ads and that kind of stuff, and there's a lot of downtime in between. Now, when it comes down to Shiva, it's actually kind of a special fight, so to speak, because the way 3 minutes work in the first phase is kind of going back to the concept I was talking about before, where if you can get an extra usage out of them, it is worth only using them for 10 seconds instead of their 20 or something like that. So, and this only applies to the 3 minutes, by the way, for Shiva. So when you look at it like this, say for example you use your battle litany, your battle voice. Technically, I guess you can't really use battle voice before the start, but like devotion, that kind of stuff. You want to be using those before you pull the boss. You want to use them 5 seconds before you pull the boss. Now, because you do that, you're technically losing 5 seconds of uptime on those raid buffs. So for example, if you look at Battle Litany, all of a sudden you're only using, I believe it lasts for 20 seconds, so you're only utilizing 15 seconds out of the 20 of that Battle Litany. Now, the reason why you do that is because you use them 5 seconds before you pull the boss, they'll actually come up before Shiva goes into the ad phase, and you can get a second usage out of those 3 minutes before the boss goes away into their ad phase, because otherwise you're gonna have a full usage during the opener, but then you're going to be losing a usage before the ad phase because you can't use it in time and Shiva disappears. So because of stuff like that, you might want to use raid buffs earlier in the opener so that you can get a second usage out of them and that kind of stuff, because of course you don't want to be using your raid buffs during the ad phase, as it will only affect 4 people instead of 8. So that's where you can kind of do some weird stuff depending on like how long a phase lasts of a certain boss, or depending on when a boss phases away and that kind of stuff. So those are kind of like some things to think about when it comes down to raid buffs. On one hand, you want to use them on cooldown as much as possible so that they not only align with other raid buffs, but so that they also align with personal damage burst phases. On the other hand, sometimes you might want to delay buffs because a boss is going to phase away for a few seconds and you can't get full utilization of them. On the other hand, sometimes you might want to delay your 3 minutes as well, like for example on E6, because we're waiting on that ninja streak attack to come up again, and because we're not gonna get a third usage of our, or like a fourth usage basically, of our 3 minutes again, we might as well just save them for 20 seconds because we're not gonna get an extra usage out of it anyway. So raid buffs, it's a little bit more of a complex topic to talk about. It's some stuff that you might want to talk about with your static as well. Of course, in Party Finder, it's kind of hard to talk about these things because you're not constantly raiding with each other, or like raiding with the same group. But when you're raiding together in a like in a static environment, it's definitely a good idea to talk about that kind of stuff. Like for example, I want to save the buffs here, use them after the boss comes back, or for example, hold off on these buffs here so that we can use them when the boss is back, like for example during E7's ad phase. Like for example, we have the DPS to clear this ad phase, don't use buffs here, keep them for when the boss comes back, and then we can basically get an extra usage on the boss, because it's much more important to, for example, get 2 sets of burst windows or 2 sets of raid buffs on the boss itself rather than only getting 1 and then using the second one on the add phase or something like that. So those are all kind of important things that you might want to talk about with your static or with your friends that you're raiding with and that kind of stuff. So I want to thank you for watching. This was a little bit more of a complex episode, I guess you could call it, but it was kind of difficult for me to keep it simple, as raid buffing is something that can get a little bit more complex, especially when we're talking about optimization and that kind of stuff. But that's gonna be it for me. I want to thank you for watching. I want to thank my Patreons for supporting me, and I'll see you in the next one.